In this video, we'll analyze 4 Garry Kasparov games where he plays against world-class opponents and proves why he could be the best chess player ever. The first opponent is the former world champion Viswanathan Anand. Kasparov starts e4 and black replies e5. Knight f3 attacks the e5 pawn and knight c6 defends. Bishop c4 pressures black's weak f7 point while preparing to castle. Black also develops his bishop in a similar way to c5. Then white unveils the Evans gambit with b4. Now if black does not take the pawn, then white just gained valuable queenside space and can continue pressing onward. So black takes the pawn, going up material, but allowing white to play c3 with tempo, supporting a central advance. Black retreats the bishop back to e7 and will have to fend off the coming storm. Kasparov's thrust forward in the center with d4. This also opens up the dark squared bishop, which means that white's queen b3 creating a battery aimed at f7 is all the more powerful because knight h6 trying to defend would be picked off by the bishop. In light of this, black plays knight a5, attacking the bishop and forcing it off the diagonal to e2. Then, since his pawn is attacked twice, black captures on d4, and white, in wanting to keep the initiative, takes the pawn with the queen, making a threat towards the g7 pawn. Black blocks this by developing the knight to f6. Kasparov keeps up the pressure with e5 attacking the knight. Black counters with knight c6, and white swings the queen over to h4. Black saves the knight, moving it to d5, which opens up an attack by the bishop on the queen. White drops her to g3, hitting the pawn, so black pushes it one square, creating dark square weaknesses around his king. White, satisfied with the damage done so far, castles his own king to safety. Now white is planning on playing c4, so black preemptively drops his knight back to b6, before white plays c4, opening up the c3 square for his knight. Black follows with d6, opening up his bishop and trying to eliminate white's advanced pawn. Kasparov makes it anything but easy for his opponent, moving the rook to d1, pinning the d6 pawn to the queen. Now black should be looking to castle here, but he instead drops the knight back to d7, adding another attacker to the pawn. This gives white the time to play bishop h6, preventing a kingside castle altogether. Then black captures the pawn on e5, leading to an exchange of knights, and the black knight ending up on e5. Black just won another pawn, but he has barely developed, whereas white's pieces are bursting with potential attacking opportunities. Kasparov brings his knight out to c3, getting ready to charge ahead. Black plays f6, opening up the square for his knight to hunt down white's pesky bishop. White pushes c5, biting down on the pinned d6 pawn. Black drops the knight to f7, hitting the bishop. White ignores this, capturing on d6 with a threat on black's bishop. Black recaptures before white defends his own bishop with queen e3. Black captures and white recaptures, looking to infiltrate the kingside with his strongest piece. Black must stop this and does so with bishop f8. Kasparov returns the queen to e3, giving check. Black's king sidesteps to f7 and the white knight leaps to d5. Black brings his bishop out to e6, trying to defend his king. White's knight f4 adds an attacker to the bishop. So black defends the bishop with the queen. In this position, white has a move to seal the game, but it's a hard one to spot. Can you find it? The move Kasparov plays is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. The move, rook e1, seems unassuming, but it sets the stage for devastating tactics. And black resigns in view of what is to come. White's threat is to move his bishop, which would open up 3 attackers on black's bishop, who would not be able to move without allowing queen b3 check, opening up a discovered attack on black's queen. And if black tries to defend his bishop, say with the rook, then white would just take the bishop. After the exchanges, we end up here, and either way that black tries to recapture the queen, he would lose. With the rook results in bishop c4, pinning the rook to the king, which would win the full rook. And capturing the king would run into bishop b5, attacking the rook, and skewering the king to the rook, which would again win the full rook. Kasparov's adept use of the daring Evans gambit in this game showcased a blend of his tactical brilliance and aggressive strategy, leading to an impressive win. The second opponent is the queen of chess, Judit Polgar. Kasparov starts c4 and black replies e6. White develops his knight to c3 before black pushes forward with d5. After white's d4, we transpose into the queen's gambit. Black's bishop b4 pins the knight to the king, and white follows with e3, opening up his bishop. Black plays c5, fighting for the center. Then white pushes a3, asking a question to the bishop. In this case, black captures the knight and white recaptures, getting doubled pawns. Black carries on development with knight f6 before white captures the pawn on d5, undoubling his pawns, and black recaptures with her pawn. Kasparov continues with an interesting move, f3, planning to either push forward in the center or even on the king side. Then black pushes c4, gaining space and also preventing white's bishop from landing on d3. White develops his knight to e2, black develops her knight to c6, and white makes his intentions clear with g4 advancing on the king side while providing a new avenue of development for his bishop. Black's h6 aims to stop further expansion, and white moves his bishop to g2, paving the way to castle. Black maneuvers her knight to a5, looking to jump into the cozy b3 square. White castles, and black leaps her knight forward, attacking the rook in the corner. Kasparov meticulously lifts his rook a square, looking to eventually swing it across his open second rank. Black castles, and white brings his knight to g3, where it can not only support a central advance, but also look to jump forward. Black develops her bishop to d7, and white shifts the queen to e1, further supporting the e-pawn push, and planning to use the open diagonal. Black's rook e8, pressuring the semi-open file, is met by the bold e4 barreling down the center. Black captures with her pawn, and white recaptures, sacrificing his g4 pawn, which black takes with the knight. With the position all opened up, white no longer wants to give away the dark squared bishop, which has been under attack for so many turns. Kasparov, right on cue, springs it to f4. Black's menacing queen h4, threatening checkmate, is met calmly by h3, pushing the knight back to f6. Kasparov presses on with e5, hitting the knight and opening his bishop on the long diagonal. Thanks to the pin on the pawn to the queen, black can ignore this, instead centralizing her rook. Then white moves his queen out of the way to f2, actually threatening to capture the knight, and the knight with limited options leaps to h5. Kasparov seizes the moment and captures on h6 with his bishop, opening the queen and rook's battery against f7, with the threat of capturing the pawn with a fork on the king and the knight. Black cannot let this happen, so she moves her rook to e7, defending the pawn. White jumps his knight to f5, attacking the rook and opening the queens to one another. Black takes the queen with check, and white recaptures with the first rank rook, connecting them on the second rank. Now black does not have time to take the bishop because her rook is still under attack. And were she to take the knight, then white would be able to recapture with his rook, attacking the knight, who would not be able to move to g3 because of the move rook g5, pinning the pawn to the king and attacking the knight. So black moves her rook to e6. Kasparov drops his bishop back to e3, and after all this, there is still the threat on the b7 pawn. So black moves the bishop to c6, offering a trade of bishops. White declines this, moving the bishop to f1 with an attack on c4, and even worse, the threat to move the bishop to e2, which would trap the knight on h5. Unfortunately for black, there isn't anything she can do, and her position is about to collapse. g6, trying to save the knight, would run into knight h6 check, followed by a capture on f7 with either the knight or the rook, depending on where the king went last move. So black plays f6, allowing her to play g6 without the fear of hanging her f7 pawn after knight h6. But white just takes the free pawn on c4, pinning the rook to the king. Black blocks this with bishop d5. Kasparov drops the bishop back to e2, attacking the knight. And black could try g6, but white now has the new threat of c4, which would force the bishop back to c6, followed by d5, forking the bishop and the rook. Black succumbs to the pressure, capturing the pawn on e5 so she could at least get a couple pawns in exchange for her knight. White captures the free piece, going up material, and black captures a second pawn on d4, opening up an attack on the bishop. White moves the bishop to g5, counter-attacking the rook, and it goes to d7. Then white plays rook a to e2, trying to simplify the position. Black desperately blocks this with the bishop, but after white captures the pawn on d4, black throws in the towel and resigns. Kasparov's strategic finesse shone brightly in this one, as his deep understanding of the game allowed him to turn a complex position into a convincing win. The third opponent is former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. Kasparov starts d4 and black replies knight f6. c4 marks the queen's gambit, to which black replies e6, opening up his bishop. White develops the knight to f3 and black plays c5, trying to exchange a flank pawn for a valuable central pawn. White follows with g3, planning to fianchetto his bishop on the long diagonal. Black goes ahead and captures the pawn on d4, and white recaptures with the knight. Then queen c7 attacks the pawn. Kasparov does not defend the pawn, instead playing knight c3, understanding that were black to capture the pawn, he would play e4 with tempo, gaining a foothold over the center, while getting a lead in development with great attacking opportunities. In light of this, black does not take the pawn. He plays a6, stopping the white knights from leaping to b5. White continues bishop g2, and only now does black take the pawn on c4, since the bishop is no longer x-raying the queen. But this hanging pawn was not a mistake by white. Kasparov wanted black to use up a move to capture the pawn. In return, he has a lead in development in the form of 3 developed minor pieces to black's 1, and black's advanced queen position means she's more vulnerable to attack. White castles, getting his king to safety, and black brings out his knight to c3, offering an exchange. White, in wanting to keep more pieces on the board, drops the knight to b3, and black pushes forward in the center with d5. White develops his bishop to f4, and black, in anticipation of the white rook landing on c1 to indirectly hit the queen, moves her out of the way to b4. Kasparov plays rook e1, planning e4 to open up the position, which would make his lead in development more apparent. Black follows with bishop e7, trying to quickly castle before the center is fired open. White pushes e4. Now black should not push his pawn, because white would have the stunning move, knight d5, attacking the queen and threatening a fork on c7. Black would have to take it, which would allow white to recapture with the pawn hitting the knight, and after it moves, white could push d6, attacking the already pinned bishop. So, with immense pressure on the d5 pawn, black has no choice but to capture on e4. Then Kasparov sets the trickiest of traps with bishop c7. The idea is that if black plays a normal move like castling, then now that white's bishop covers the b6 square, white's a3 would trap the queen after queen c4 and bishop f1. Black sees this, so he plays e3, opening up an escape for the queen and giving back one pawn, which white takes with the rook, and this buys black enough time to get his king castled. White pushes h3, cutting off g4 from the enemy queen, and re-establishing the threat to trap her. So black plays knight a7, giving his queen an escape via the c-file, and preparing to jump his knight forward to b5 to try to ease some of the pressure. Kasparov moves his rook to c1, securing control of the c-file, and black jumps the knight to b5, offering an exchange of pieces. White plays a3, hitting the queen, and black captures the knight on c3, counterattacking the white queen. White recaptures with the first rank rook, keeping it on the open file, and black shifts the queen out of the attack to a4, pinning the knight to white's queen. White immediately gets out of this with queen c1 before black finally retreats his queen to friendly territory with queen d7. White moves his bishop to e5, planning a 7th rank infiltration with his rook, but black meets this with knight d5, covering the 7th rank and forking the 2 rooks. Already a pawn down, Kasparov actually did not blunder the exchange, but he is offering more material as he surreptitiously assembles an attack. He moves his rook from e to d3, and black captures the rook on c3, seeing that were white to take the queen on e7, then black would win it back with knight e2, a royal fork. So white recaptures the knight with his queen, maintaining the attack on the black queen, but also creating a battery aimed at the core of the black king's shelter. Black must move his queen, and she goes to b5. Then white captures the pawn on g7, attacking the rook and blasting open the kingside. Now black could move his rook out of the way, but white would constantly have attacking opportunities, and it would be a struggle for black to hold on. Instead, black understands that he is already up the exchange, so he gives back some material by capturing the rook on d3, deflecting the queen away from the defense of the bishop on g7 after it takes the queen, before capturing the bishop with his king. Now the result is that white has slightly less material to build up an attack, and black has 2 rooks for the queen, which is technically worth more for black. But black's pieces are still not active, and his king is not exactly safe. Kasparov plays a sharp move, knight c5, adding an attacker to the b7 pawn. Black could take the knight, but white would just win it back with queen c3 forking the bishop and the king, and black would lose his bishop pair and a key defender of the weak dark squares around his king. So black moves his rook to d8 instead, hitting the queen. She moves to e3. Then black plays rook b8, defending his pawn on b7. But this was a terrible mistake. Can you find the winning move for white? The move Kasparov plays is queen e5, forking the king and the rook. The black king sidesteps to h6 and white grabs the rook. Black desperately picks up the knight on c5, but now white is the one who is up material, and with black's king out in the open, white is bound to win some more soon. Queen c7 attacks both the rook and the bishop. Black plays rook d1 check, saving his rook. White moves the king to h2, and black grabs the pawn on f2 with his bishop. Now for white, grabbing the bishop on c8 would be a huge blunder, because black would have a draw by repetition with bishop g1, forcing the king to h1, then moving the bishop from d4, opening a discovered check, and going back and forth. And were white to block the check with his bishop, then black would just take the bishop and move the rook from f2 to f1 back and forth, understanding that were the white king ever to go to g1, then black would move the rook from f2 to c2, attacking the queen and opening up a discovered check. Kasparov, until the very last moment of the game, remains alert, leaving the poisoned bishop and going for queen f4, forking the king and the other bishop, but he probably would have continued by forking the king and the rook after the king would move. The king doesn't move though, because black, seeing the material deficit that he will soon have, resigns the game. Kasparov's quality was clear as he confidently played down material using his positional strength and tactical insight to clinch a remarkable win. The final game is against Kasparov's greatest rival and another world champion, Anatoly Karpov. Kasparov starts d4 and black replies d5. White unveils the queen's gambit with c4 and black declines this with e6. White's knight c3 places more pressure on d5, and black develops his bishop to e7. White decides to immediately clarify the situation in the center by capturing on d5, and black recaptures with the pawn. Then white brings his bishop to f4, getting it outside of the pawn chain with e3 coming. And black plays knight f6, preparing to castle. White pushes e3, opening up his kingside pieces, and black castles. Kasparov plays d3, aiming his bishop at the kingside, and black pushes c5, challenging white's center. White develops his final minor piece with knight f3, and black jumps his knight to c6 before white castles. Black's bishop g4 pins the knight to the queen, undermining the defense of the d4 pawn. So white captures the pawn on c5, releasing the tension, and black recaptures with the bishop. Then white plays h3, hitting the bishop, who proceeds to capture the knight on f3, weakening the defense of the d4 square. After white recaptures with the queen, black is able to push his weak, isolated pawn to d4 in order to exchange it off. Now Kasparov does not want black's pieces to get too active, so he does not take the pawn, instead playing knight e4, attacking the bishop. Black retreats it to e7, and white slides his rook over to d1 in line with the queen. Were black to capture on e3 with the pawn, then knight takes f6 check, followed by bishop takes h7 check, would open up a discovered attack, winning the queen. So black gets his queen out of the line of fire, moving her to a5 with an attack on the a2 pawn. Kasparov leaves it for the taking, maneuvering his knight to g3, where it eyes up the f5 square. Black captures on e3 first, and white recaptures with the pawn, opening the f-file, before black greedily captures the pawn on a2. White jumps his knight to f5, attacking key squares on the black king side. Black, beginning to see the swarm of pieces surrounding his king, retreats his queen to e6 to defend. But it's a little late for that. White's bishop swoops to h6, attacking the g7 pawn for a second time. The trick is that black should not take the bishop, because queen g3 check would threaten checkmate, which would force the knight to sacrifice itself, and after the queen would take, black wouldn't even be able to block the check with the queen because of knight h6 opening a discovered attack on the queen. So black would be forced to block the next check with the bishop, which would allow h4 winning a piece. Back to the game. In light of this, black drops the knight to e8, defending the pawn. Then Kasparov moves the queen to h5, threatening to capture on e7, and then to capture on g7, opening up the threat of queen h7 checkmate. So white plays g6, blunting the diagonal. This also looks like a fork on the knight and the queen, but white has queen g4 pinning the pawn to the king. Black hops the knight to e5, attacking the queen, so she moves to g3. Then black moves the bishop to f6 to defend weak dark squares around his king. Now Kasparov could take the rook, but he prefers to preserve his powerful bishop that punctures the black king side. He instead moves his bishop to b5 with the threat of taking the knight, removing the defender of the d6 square, and then playing rook d6, which would win the bishop. But this allows black to move the knight to g7, where it threatens to take the knight on f5 with an attack on the white queen and defense of the d6 square, meaning rook d6 wouldn't work anymore. White takes the knight with the bishop, and black recaptures with his own bishop, getting it out of the way, so that after white's rook d6, black can now safely move the queen to b3, attacking white's bishop, and the knight on f5 now that the pawn is no longer pinned. It seems that black has fended off the attack, and it's true that he's done a good job, but white's pieces are waiting patiently nearby for the slightest of slip-ups by black. Kasparov captures the bishop on g7, removing a defender of the knight on e5. Black does not recapture, instead taking the bishop on b5 so that his queen defends the knight. White returns the knight to f5, again using the pin on the pawn to the king. Black's rook a to d8 offers an exchange of rooks, which white, in wanting to keep pieces on the board, declines by moving his rook to f6. Black's rook jumps to the second rank. White advances his queen to g5 before black takes another pawn with queen takes b2. Then white plays the calm king h1, just getting his king out of any potential checks. Black, inspired, does the same thing with king h8, and this is the slip-up. Can you find how white wins here? The reason king h8 loses is because it not only puts the king on a square where it's susceptible to checks along the diagonal, it also removes the defender of the f7 pawn. Kasparov, with the precision of a surgeon, plays the only winning move, knight d4. This incredible move does everything. It interferes with the queen's defense of the knight, and it stops the queen from going to b5 where it could defend the knight. It also clears the f-file for the doubled rooks to attack the f7 pawn, so that were the knight to move, or the rook to move to defend the knight, then white would take twice on f7, opening up several potential checkmating combinations. So black desperately captures the knight with his rook, hoping to settle for a knight and two pawns for a rook. But Kasparov does not take back the rook. He takes the knight on e5, and black resigns. The rook is under attack, and there are all sorts of discovered check threats. Black's only defense would be rook d2, opening up the queens to one another. but white would play queen e7 attacking the rook, which would force black's rook to retreat to defend. Then white would capture twice on f7, creating a battery along the 7th rank. The threat would be rook takes to h7, followed by queen f7 checkmate. So black would preemptively move the king out of check to g8, with the queen defending the g7 square. White's plan would then involve pushing his pawn to the e5 square to interfere with the queen's defense. And black wouldn't have a way to stop this. He could try checking and returning the queen to h6, where it would be stuck defending against checkmate. But then white's plan would change to just pushing the pawn to glory. For demonstration, if black were to try and catch up, then white would inevitably get a second queen. This game was a perfect example of Kasparov's ability to combine creativity and tactical sharpness, especially in high-stakes matches like the World Championship. Through these 4 games, Garry Kasparov's exceptional skill against top players is evident, bolstering his case as the greatest to ever play. So do you think he is the best chess player ever? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.